ang aming proyekto sa Araling Panlipunan. Ngayon ating mapapag-aralan ang kolonyalismo na nangyari sa Asya. Unahin natin sa bansang tinatawag na Perlas ng Silanganan, ang Pilipinas. May 70,000 pulo at 100. Mayaman sa likas na yaman. Bago pa man maganap ang kolonyalismo, ang Pilipinas ay isa lamang normal. Ang mga mamamayan ay namumuhay ng normal. Pangunahing hanap buhay ang pagsasaka, paggingisda, pag-aalaga ng hayop. Nakatira lamang sa mga simpleng bahay kubo. Mahilig mag-alaga ng mga hayop, manok at iba pang mga hayop na magagamit sa pang-araw-araw na buhay. Ngunit ito lahat ay nagbago nang dumating sa bansa si Ferdinand Magellan. Si Ferdinand Magellan ay isa sa mga pinadala ng mga Espanya upang maghanap ng bagong rutang kanilang pagtatakasan sa panahon ng digmaan sa pananakop sa ilang bansa sa Asya at sa iba pang bansa. Si Magellan ang nakahanap sa Pilipinas o nakadiskubre sa Pilipinas na ating tinutungtungan sa ngayon. Ngunit ito ay nagbago, naglaho at nag-iba. Nandito kami upang ipahayag ang mga salita ni Jesucristo. Nagsimula ang kolonyalismo ng 1565, Miguel Lopez de Legazpi.
Masaysayang araw po, it's showtime! Matapos ang pagkasawi ni Magellan sa Mactan, nagpadala ang hari ng Espanya ng iba pang mga ekspedisyon patungo sa mga kapuluang ito. Ang mga ekspedisyon ni Loaiza, Cabot, Saavedra at Vic na may 3 pangunahing misyon: makipagkasundo sa mga bayan, magpaumanhin sa mga taga-Cebu sa nangyaring panggagahasa ng mga tauhan ni Magellan, ibalik ang mga labi ni Magellan. Lahat ng ito ay nabigo. Marami pa sa mga pinuno nito ay nabihag ng mga karibal na Portuges na hawak ang kalapit na Moluccas o Spice Islands. Ngunit, inutusan ng hari ng Espanya, Felipe II, ang Viceroyalty ng Nueva España sa Mexico na muling magpadala ng isa pang ekspedisyon sa Pilipinas. At si adelantado Miguel Lopez de Legazpi ang napili. Ngunit, katuwang niya ang isang paring Agustino, si Padre Andres de Urdaneta, na bago maging pari ay veterano na ng ekspedisyong Loaiza. Kaya alam na niya ang ruta patungong Pilipinas at pamilyar na sa pasikot-sikot sa kapuluan. Siya ang magiging alas ng ekspedisyong ito, kaya magtatagumpay. Umalis sila ng Mexico noong November 1864 at matapos ang 2 buwan, nakarating sa Samar noong February 20, 1565. Sa Bohol, sa pag-aakalang sila ay mga Portuges, nagsilika sa kabundukan o nag-ilihan ng mga tao. Ngunit, nang malaman ni Raja Sikatuna na ibang mga tao ito, siya ay nakipagsandugo kay Legazpi. Isang punto sa ating kasaysayan na ipinenta ni Juan Luna at ang obra maestra na yan ngayon ay nasa palasyo ng Malacanang. Kumpara sa mga Boholano, tunay na kapatid na ang turing nila sa mga Espanyol bilang isang dugo, wala naman itong kahulugan sa mga tumalikod din sa kapatirang ito tulad ng binanggit ni Andres Bonifacio sa kanyang ang dapat mabatid ng mga Tagalog. Noong April 27, dumating sila sa Sugbo, ngunit nilabanan ng mga tauhan ni Raja Tupas. Ngunit hindi naglahon dahil sa mga diplomatikong approach ni Legazpi, nakipagkasundo rin sa mga Espanyol si Raja Tupas. Kalaunan ang Cebu ang naging pinakaunang kolonyal na lungsod sa Pilipinas noong 1571. Ngunit hindi ibig sabihin na nasakop ng Cebu ay nasakop ng buong Pilipinas. Simula lamang ito ng mahabang proseso ng kongkista. Lumipat siya sa Panay noong 1569 at ginamit ang mga dayuhan ng mga mandirigmang Panayanhon upang tulungan sila sa paggalugad at pananakop ng mga kalabang Moro sa Mindoro at Luzon na nilulusob sila. Pinamunuan sila ng apo ni Legazpi na si Juan de Salcedo at Martin de Goiti. Tampuhan ng mga Bisaya at Tagalog, noon pa pala yun. Isang taon matapos na matalo ni de Goiti, si Raja Suliman at ang mga taga-Maynila noong 1570, tumungo doon mismo si Legazpi at itinatag niya kasama ni Padre Urdaneta ang lungsod ng Maynila 442 years ago, June 24, 1571, na ginugunita ngayon bilang Araw ng Maynila. Namatay siya sa kanyang lungsod makalipas ang isang taon, August 20, 1572, at inilibing sa simbahan ng San Agustin sa Maynila. Ngayon, ang lumang monumento ni Legazpi at Urdaneta, ninanakawan at kinakalakal ang mga bakal. Nako, magtigil kayo. Bahagi po yan ng kasaysayan. Ako po si Sao Chua, pas telebisyon ng bayan. And that was Showtime.
Sa panahong ito, nagsimula silang pumatay ng lalaki, bata, matanda, at iba pa. Wala rin silang pinapalampas kahit sila ay mga babae. Ako naman tayo sa bansang may pinakamahabang pangalan ang syudad, ang Thailand. Dahil sa kanilang magagaling na pinuno,
maaari kayong manatili dito sa aming bansa. Ibibigay namin ang batalyong estado ng aming bansa. Huwag nyo lang tatakupin ang aming bansa.
sila ay hindi nasakop ng kahit anong bansa sa Europeo. Sumunod naman tayo sa bansang kinikilala sa katawagang Land of the Rising Sun, ang Japan.
Here are the top 5 places that you should visit in Japan and when you should visit.
Nangunguna sa pinakamataas na ekonomiya sa buong mundo. Namumuhay ng tahimik ang mga Hapon noong panahong iyon. Mapayapa, walang gulo, at nagbabantay ang mga tinatawag nilang samurai, shogunate, emperor, at iba pa. Ngunit ito ay nagbago dahil sa sakop.
In Japan's feudal era, the European missionaries who led to the country's isolation ended up positively affecting the country as it was able to retain its sovereignty and unique culture while still advancing technologically. This can be better understood with a bit of background information on the events preceding the isolation. The feudal era in Japan began with the Kamakura period in 1185 when Yoritomo Minamoto took control of the country and became its first shogun. The shogun, literally meaning military dictator, was the political leader of Japan during this era. This was usually a hereditary title separate from the emperor. Japan's feudal era was very similar to the feudalism in the West. The daimyos in Japan were equivalent to the feudal lords of Europe. Eventually, the Kamakura shogunate gave way to the Ashikaga shogunate when Ashikaga Takauji drove the previous shogun out of Japan's capital, Kyoto, in 1336. The Ashikaga family kept control of the country for about 200 years, until Oda Nobunaga, a powerful daimyo and a strong military leader, overcame the rest of the daimyo, becoming Japan's new shogun. There were two important events under Nobunaga's rule. First, the emperor remained in Kyoto, but the shogunate moved to the city of Edo, which would later be renamed to what we know it as today, Tokyo. And second, Europe made its first contact with Japan when Portuguese sailors were shipwrecked on its coast. Trade began between Japan and who the Japanese referred to as the Nanban, the Portuguese, Spanish, and later the Dutch. Soon after Nobunaga's death, a leader under his command came to power. This leader was Tokugawa Ieyasu. With him came the beginning of the Tokugawa period, also known as the Edo period. As trade continued with Europe, Christian missionaries came to Japan to convert the population. Nobunaga had supported the religion as it helped trade, but the Tokugawa shoguns saw it as a threat. When the Spanish conquered the Philippines, Ieyasu feared they would do the same to Japan. He also questioned the loyalty of the daimyo who converted to Christianity. This fear eventually led him to forbid the practice of Christianity in 1606. The fear was still there though, so Ieyasu's grandson, Tokugawa Iemitsu, implemented 2 edicts. One forbidding Japanese ships and people to leave Japan, as well as forbidding trade with foreign nations, and the other further prescribing the practice of Christianity. The period after this is known as the Sakoku period. All trade with Europe ended except with the Netherlands. The Dutch maintained their commercial relationship with Japan by adhering to all Japan's rules and policies. Through continued contact with the Dutch, Japanese technologies were able to advance substantially without any risk to Japan's independence. They created a steady iron industry, catching up with the rest of the world. They also greatly improved their shipbuilding with the help of the impressive Dutch Navy. Soon they were able to increase their military power with the improved weaponry discovered through the Dutch trade. This goes to show that even without the Spanish and Portuguese traders, the Japanese were able to advance easily at a fast pace. One might argue that when the seclusion ended and Japan's borders were open once again, the effects of the missionaries would be the same as if they had never closed off in the first place. This is untrue, because when Japan reintegrated into the world, they were much more cautious and took much more time to acclimate themselves to their situation. There was much less cultural and religious influence from the West for this reason, and for the reason that the rest of the world's nations did not want to risk losing their trade opportunities with Japan again, and as a result were much more willing to go along with the slow pace of the Japanese. So in the end, through its seclusion, Japan was able to maintain its unique and interesting culture while still advancing at a rate equal to that of the rest of the world. When they finally opened up their country and ended the Sakoku, it was done on their own terms.
Wari-wari susakoku desu.
Hi!
By the mid-19th century, Japan was nearing the end of its Edo period, also known as the Time of Great Peace. The ruling regime, the Tokugawa shogunate, was at the head of a feudal system which had stabilized Japan for over 200 years. In 1635, the passage of the seclusion laws had virtually removed Japan from all foreign influences. However, the arrival of the Commodore Matthew C. Perry in 1853 prompted the reversal of this isolationist policy. In the following time period, Japan experienced a technological revolution and boomed onto the world stage. Born on April 10, 1794 to a naval captain, it was only natural for Perry to pursue a career in the Navy himself. At the age of 17, he received a naval commission and rose through the ranks while serving on many vessels during the 1812 and Mexican-American Wars. During this time, Perry became one of the leading proponents of modernizing the United States Navy to include steam-powered ships. In 1837, he oversaw and took command of the Navy's second steamship, the USS Fulton. Eventually, Perry was dubbed the father of the steam navy. In the 1630s, almost 200 years before Perry's birth, Japan had enacted a foreign relations policy known as Sakoku, which literally translates as locked country. Under these laws, No European foreigner could enter Japan without being subjected to the death penalty. This radical policy was intended to shelter Japan and the power of its leader, the shogun, from the religious and cultural influences of colonial powers such as Spain and Portugal. As time progressed, Sakoku also prevented the imperialist British Empire from forcing their way into Japan. The bloody scenes of the First Opium War between China and Britain over trade disputes in the 1840s were never repeated in Japan thanks to the policy of Sakoku. However, this policy also caused Japan to be oblivious to the major scientific advances of the Industrial Revolution. Thus, even though Japan was largely conflict-free during this era, it was quickly becoming technologically inferior to the rest of the world. In 1852, Perry, now a Commodore, set his sights on securing a trade agreement with Japan, which was deemed by the West to be a closed country. Prior to selling to Japan, Perry studied books and even consulted with the Philip Franz von Siebold, who had lived near and studied Japan for over 8 years. Now armed with maps which Siebold had provided, Perry sailed for Japan with a group of 4 ships, 2 of which were steam-powered and 560 men. Perry's goal was to be a peacemaker and to bring Japan into what he called the family of civilized nations. Ironically, the Commodore's embracement of steam technology posed a challenge when he arrived in the Japanese town of Shimoda on July 8, 1853. The Japanese villagers, never having seen a steamship before, thought that the giant dragons puffing smoke were approaching and promptly raised an army of over 17,000 in order to defend themselves from the approaching threat. The reaction of the Japanese people can be reflected by one famous poem written after Perry's arrival. The steam-powered ships break the halcyon slumber of the Pacific. A mere 4 boats are enough to make us lose sleep at night. However, Perry never wished to disturb the Japanese people. His intention was to deliver a letter from President Fillmore to the Emperor asking for Japan's friendship and trade. On July 12th, the Japanese official Kayama insisted that Commodore Perry go to the port of Nagasaki in an attempt to put more distance between the powerful Americans and Japanese capital city of Edo, later to be known as Tokyo. Perry refused to leave and refused to deliver his letter to anyone but the Emperor himself. Unbeknownst to the Commodore, the Emperor of Japan during the Edo period was actually a powerless figurehead. The official who made all the important political decisions was known as the Shogun. Upon hearing of Commodore Perry's arrival, the shogun at the time, named Ayoshi, fell ill and left his advisors to run the country. In order to make himself seem mysterious and powerful, Perry had his crew address him by the title of Admiral and withdrew into his ship's cabin. This ploy proved quite effective. His cabin came to be known by the Japanese as the abode of his high and mighty mysteriousness. After his fleet began to run out of provisions, Perry agreed to hand the letter over to the princesses of Izu and Iwami on the 14th of July. 3 days later, Perry left for Hong Kong, with intentions of returning the next spring to hear the response of the Japanese. When he heard rumors that Russia was attempting to contact the Japanese, Perry decided to return prematurely on February 13, 1854 with 9 ships and over 1,600 men. The Japanese, having been impressed with the Americans' technology, industry, and scientific accomplishments, agreed to help Perry to negotiate a treaty in Kanagawa. Negotiations were long and arduous, as all discussions had to be translated into Dutch before they could be translated into each party's native language. When the Japanese were reluctant to meet all the terms of Perry's proposal, he invited them to his ship for a feast, and gave the Japanese people gifts including guns, perfumes, a miniature train, a telegraph, and a steam engine. On March 31st, 1854, thanks to much persistence from Commodore Perry, the Treaty of Kanagawa was signed, securing peace and friendship between the United States and Japan. Additionally, the ports of Shimoda and Hakodate were opened up to trade, and Japan agreed to supply and assist U.S. ships, which were in the area. The treaty caused much discontent in Japan. The proponents of isolation strongly opposed its enforcement. In 1866, an alliance between the Satsuma and Choshu domains challenged the power of the shogunate. The resulting internal strife was only quelled in 1868 with the following declaration by the Meiji Emperor.
We shall henceforth exercise supreme authority in all the internal and external affairs of the country. Consequently, the title of emperor must be substituted for that of shogun, in which the treaties have been made.
With the fall of the shogun during the so-called Meiji Restoration, the feudal system, which had been the social structure of Japan for hundreds of years, was effectively abolished. Japan was free to truly enter the age of technological revolution. Within 5 years, it had already acquired 26 of the Commodore's favorite vehicles, steamships. The Meiji Restoration and its consequences are generally held to be a direct response to the arrival of Perry and the removal of the Sokoku policy. Commodore Perry's legacy to the Japanese people can still be seen today. Japanese celebrate the anniversary of his arrival every July with the annual Black Ship Festivals. Additionally, a small museum has been constructed in Japan in order to commemorate the effects of Perry. Perhaps the greatest tribute to Perry's efforts can be seen in the city of Tokyo, formerly Edo, which has become a huge metropolis and one of the leading centers of technological innovation in the world. Its towering skyscrapers and bustling streets are a direct result of Commodore Matthew C. Perry, the man who opened up the portal to Japan.
Commander, the president is calling you. Then I will go. President, why did you call me? I want you to do something so that Japan will open their country to others. I understand.
Konnichiwa.
How can I help you?
I am here to have a request. Dahil sa galing ni Machu Perry ay nagkaroon ng koneksyon ng Japan sa iba pang mga bansa.